All right, step one, building the scope and sequence. Okay, so at this point, we should have completed our IA analysis documents. So I want you to pay close attention. This is a process. I can't get to the second part of the process until I do the first part of the process. So if you are someone who spent a lot of good time analyzing the first IA and filling out the document as far as going from steps 1 through 4, checking the standard, defining the skill, identifying the power, and developing key points, you should feel very ready to do this next step. If I'm missing any of these things from my IA analysis document, my next step is going to be harder to do to fruition. So when I say your document is complete, I should see all of these boxes filled for each question under the IA tested items. So you should see for every question, there is a standard, there is a skill, and there is a power aim. These three things are going to become super important when looking at a scope, building a scope and sequence, and also creating those objectives and putting them into a calendar. For this first step with building a scope and sequence, we are going to be focusing on the skill part because this is where we start. All right, so what's next? One, we need to gather all the skills covered in IA1. All I simply need to do is look back at this section here, that skill section, and I need to, two, decide when to teach what. And this is important. So, how do we decide when to teach what? There are a few things we need to consider. One, what skills are the simplest versus which are more complex? We know there are some skills that have steps 1 through 3, and then there are other skills that have steps 1 through 5. There are some skills that require a little bit more thinking. So this is definitely a question I would consider. The second question you need to consider, and this is my big question, which skills could be considered building blocks? Because if there are building blocks or skills that you can build other skills on top of, those are the ones that I want to start with and then go from there. So when I look into my IA analysis document, I should see I have all of these skills outlined. First thing I want to do is just gather all the skills. So this is an example from my IA. When I go down this list, going from questions 1 through 22, the skills that I find are characterization, theme, character impact, word meaning, author's perspective, main idea, sequence, and text features. So the first thing I'm going to do when considering when to teach what is I'm going to consider last year. Last year, I found that word meaning and text features were just not very big questions for us in the first IA. Like there was one question per skill, and I personally felt that they could have been taught later. Like I think there are other skills that deserve a little bit more attention because you're going to see when you get to IA2 and IA3 that a lot of stuff comes out of those skills that I need to pay more attention to those and just put these ones on the back burner. The second thing I want to do is decide what skills would I consider my building blocks? Like, what are those base skills that other skills kind of build off of? And those two skills, and the reason why I have two is because one is going to be for fiction and one is going to be for nonfiction. Those two skills are characterization and main idea. So, why these two skills when I think about building blocks? So, when I think of characterization, I think about the fact that fiction stories are character driven. So if my kids know characters, that helps them find the theme because theme there's a character doing something in the beginning, the middle, and the end, and there's a character who is learning something. If my kids know characters, they can determine character impacts on stories. If I know who a character is, if I can use those characterizations, see how a character changes or why they do different things in different situations, I can determine the impact that they have on a story. So I think characterization is one of my building blocks. And it's something that when I think about fiction, I want it to be the first fiction skill I teach before I teach skills like theme and character impact. On the nonfiction or informational side, I have my main idea. And the reason why I find this to be a building block is because if a kid can give me the gist and main idea of a text, I believe they can answer any question for an informational text. For instance, students see structures like sequence, one of my other skills, much clearer when they can give the main idea or give the gist of a text. When I think about author's perspective, I think about how that is a more complex skill than main idea, and it builds off of it because main idea, knowing it, leads to students accessing bias in the text. If I can find the main idea, I can also find what is it that the author wants me to know and why. So I need to consider these things when I calendar my scope and sequence. Last piece, note this. Once skills are introduced, meaning once they're taught for the first time, they do not simply go away. We know from science that and studies that a kid needs to have 18 to about 22 at bats at a skill practicing perfect in order to master it. So once I teach characterization in week 2, I'm not going to lose sight of that. It's going to come back. And it's going to come back multiple times. I need to constantly spiral where it makes sense. And like I just said, kids can answer theme and characterization questions in the same round of practice. So later on in my scope and sequence, when theme comes up, I can also attach questions about characterization on there for that review and for that constant spiral. So with all that considered, this is something how my scope of sequence will look. So I have weeks 1 through 10, starting with that intro to ELA, leading to the week that they take the interim assessment. So I wanted characterization and main idea. Again, I feel like my two building block skills that I think all the fiction and nonfiction skills are going to build off of that coming first. And then other skills like theme, author's perspective, and character impact coming after it. Two things that I want to know. One, when I look at the secondary/spiral skills, so I know these are my focus skills. These are the things that I'm going to continue to spiral week by week. So constant spiral skills, because remember, they do not go away. So when I'm working on theme, I can still bring back that characterization and maybe throw in a main idea question to please do now. When I work on author's perspective, I can still start off with a question for a main idea and also have maybe a theme question to my please do now. When I get to character impact, again, building off of that characterization and that theme in those rounds of practice, and then maybe my please do now has to do with author's perspective. The second thing I want to know is that you may look at this and be like, that's a lot. Like every box is filled, and there are 2 skills in the first box. The reason why this looks like this and different from the other ones is because I was introducing these skills and just practicing the skills in these first 5 weeks here. Like I wanted to make sure kids knew how to do the skills. This is where, I think when we get into the latter half, this is where those teachers who feel like, oh, I don't want to teach to a test, or oh, I don't want to just focus on this, I want to do more. This is where you shine. Because at this point, I'm at the point where the first unit focused on the skill, and now students should be ready to practice those skills while studying books and exploring topics. So we isolated these skills at first. Now let's integrate them and put them all together as we read a text, as we explore a topic in nonfiction. And then also I have that writing component here.